cloud. Yes. I mentioned to Christine, I started to bring, the session up, and Zoom started doing an update. So if I hesitate, it changed some of the features. So I may be, learning some of this on the fly. So just a heads up. So good afternoon, everyone. As Christine said, I'm Lori Gurman. Most of you know me. I'm the state E-rate coordinator. This is my 17th year supporting both schools and libraries. So this is the Veterans Workshop. So it does assume, some previous knowledge. But since a lot of this, you do this once a year, don't hesitate if you say, Lori, I don't understand what you're talking about. All right. That's not going to hurt my feelings. All right. Just let me know. All right. If you need a clarification, a reminder. All right. I want to make sure everybody's caught up here. And let's see. I think we have one more sitting in the waiting room, Christine. I don't know if you see that or not.
Oops, sorry. Yeah, they have been I've asked them to join. I've admitted them, but they're still in joining mode. And I think we have another person from that library who is in attendance right now. So I'm going to admit we had another one just join. So hopefully, yeah, that's Marion, I don't know if you know who else at Swanton Library is trying to join, but it seems like it's stuck. So you can private message me out, or maybe they're going to try again. Okay. All right. I think we're ready to go.
Okay. Let's jump in. All right. Now, I am going to pop it in here just one more time. In the chat is the URL that'll take you out to my resource library. And I'm going to go over there real quick. All right, just so you can see what it looks like. You want to scroll down to the E-rate resources, and you'll see here are the library presentations right here at the top. But as we mentioned, I did add a slide, and so I'm going to be updating this. It's just one additional slide, right? But if you want to go out and get the most current slide deck, I'm going to be updating that this evening. But just so you know. All right, our agenda for today. As veterans, most of you are aware that with E-rate, it's typical to be dealing with up to 3 funding years at any given time. So, here we are, the bulk of the training, it's going to be about the upcoming funding year 2026. But right off the bat, we're going to start talking about 2024, all right, because there's some things you may still need to do for this past funding year. All right, so we'll start there, completing 2024, make sure everything's been done there. All right, then we're going to talk about where are you at for 2025, our current funding year. Then we'll step into preparing for 2026. Now, when we talk about 2025, it's where are we at? Also some changes, right? I'm sure you've heard of the biggies, right? But we'll be talking about changes that will impact 25. Again, then preparing for 26. Some things to be aware of there, all right, as well as the new category 2 budget. So, if you do apply for, if you're CEPA compliant and you apply for Cat 2, what that new budget amount will be, or, maybe you're not currently applying for Cat 2, but looking at the budget numbers, this might entice you to apply for category 2. All right, and again, as we go through this, please don't hesitate to ask questions. Now, we'll finish out the afternoon with application process reminders, because again, a lot of this, we do this once a year. Just remind you, here's the process, go back and look at this information, start that planning, some information that you might need to update in the portal. All right, so again, we'll finish out the afternoon there. All right, so as I said, let's start first with last funding year. So funding year 2024, remember with E-rate funding years, we always classify them by when the services typically start. All right, so funding year 2024 started July 1, 2024, and then ended for what we call recurring service June 30th, 2025. That is the service period. So the biggest thing right now that most folks need to do to finish out the previous funding year is filing for the reimbursement. Now I focus on the bear form, that's that built into the applicant reimbursement form, because this is the form that the applicants file. Right. But remember that, you could have or may have received a discounted bill from your service provider, where let's say you're at an 80% discount rate, the vendor would have filed, or the service provider, we use that interchangeably here, they would have invoiced you for the non-discount portion. So if you're at an 80% discount rate, they would have invoiced you for the 20% non-discount portion. And then that falls on the service provider to file the service provider invoice to get that balance from USAC. But that falls on the service provider to do. All right. So again, I don't spend a lot of time, talking about that form so much. All right. So you need to go back, verify, has everything been reimbursed? All right. You received the service, you paid the invoice. Have you filed for that reimbursement? So again, this is for recurring service. So it's your internet, or the bandwidth, down to your branches. It might be, say, I'm going to say the word hotspots for the bookmobile. We'll talk about the distinctions there. All right, any of that, monthly recurring service, where you use the service, each month, you pay the invoice. All right, that July 1 through June 30th service. All right. So the bear form, the deadline, each of, there's an E-rate form for everything, and each one has its own unique deadline. All right. Specific deadline. So for the bear form, the deadline is 120 days from the last date to receive service. Since the funding year closed on June 30th, 2025, 120 days out makes that deadline October 28th. All right. So coming up here in just a few weeks. Now, non-recurring, this would be if you filed for what we call internal connections under category 2. So that's where, you requested like a one-time purchase for equipment. So, whether it was a switch, some access points, right? It's that, again, it's a non-recurring, typically a one-time purchase. So with the internal connections, we get the benefit of, it's kind of detailed. We can start purchasing the equipment as much as 90 days before the start of the funding year. But then we also get 90 days on the back end of the funding year to get that equipment purchased and get it, the installation completed. So the deadline to ask for reimbursement for that equipment, that non-recurring purchase, is 120 days from September 30th. So for the 24 funding year, right, for the equipment, you had until September 30th, so just about a little over a week ago, September 30th of 2025, to get the equipment, installed, basically receive the equipment, get the installation complete. So you may not, if you were doing this right at the very back end of that funding year, you may not have completed paying the invoices yet. All right. So once you get the invoices paid, then you would file, if you did not receive a discounted bill, you would file the bear form. Now, with that non-recurring, since you technically had until September 30th, to get the equipment and, get all that done, then the deadline for that is 120 days past September 30th, all right, which would make that January 28th, 2026. All right, so you still have ample time to get that reimbursement in. Now, if, especially when we're talking about this, the recurring service, right, again, pretty much anything under category 1, if you need more time to get that bear invoice, the bear form filed, within Epic, you can ask for a one-time extension, all right, an invoice extension. And that would basically extend the deadline out another 120 days. So that would give you until February 25th, 2026 to get this done. And it's something that I recommend that you do. Let's say if you haven't filed the bear yet, or maybe you've just filed it, but the funds haven't been dispersed yet. It's a good idea to go ahead and ask for the extension. If you don't need the extra time, no harm done. All right. But, over the years, we've seen this happen where, maybe an applicant files the bear by the October 28th deadline, but unbeknownst to you, maybe you made a mistake on the form. All right. And then the bear form gets denied, but you don't find out about the denial until the deadline has passed. All right. If you have that extension, if something gets denied, you would have until that February 25th date to refile the bear. All right. So if you don't ask for the extension and something gets denied, then you have to jump through the hoops to file for an appeal, explain why you missed the deadline, and those oftentimes aren't approved. All right. So like I said, ask for the extension. It's really quick. You do it within Epic. If you go out to my resource page, I actually have a document out there. Let me show you where it's located, just to make it easy to find. All right, so if we scroll down, these are not well organized. I apologize. But if you scroll down, here's a step-by-step guide on how to file the bearer form. All right, if this is new to you. And then here's the step-by-step guide for asking for the extension. Now, this is something that the portal automatically grants. It's not like, USAC staff has, where they have to go out and look at something and, and make an approval. It's the system automatically grants it. But again, step-by-step guide on how to do that. And like I said, if you don't need the extra time, no harm done. It just saves a lot of heartburn, just in case something gets denied. And again, let me know if you have questions about that. Now, bearer invoicing. All right. This is something that last year was our first year using the invoicing within Epic. Now, it's not listed with the other E-rate forms, where you find like the 470, the 471, and so on. In order to get to the invoicing, on the blue menu bar, once you go into Epic, to the far right, you'll see that little series, the 3/3 tiles. When you click there, you'll see the option for Epic Invoice. Now, if you click on the tiles and invoicing's not listed, it means you've not basically been granted rights to the bearer form. So if you are the account administrator in Epic, you can go in and extend the rights to yourself. Or if you're the AA, but you have another user in the portal, go in and extend that user's rights. Right? You would have to give them access to the bearer form. It's also known as the 472. But again, if invoicing isn't showing up, it means you don't have rights to the form yet. Okay. Yeah, I apologize. The last bullet here, I do want to point out that when you go to file a bearer form in this on this new online version, there is an option to upload invoices. The old version of the bearer portal, what we refer to as Old Bessie, quite fondly, there was no option to upload any documentation. The new portal does have an upload option. All right, but the general consensus is don't upload like a copy, copies of invoices and all of that. Wait for USAC to request it, because sometimes uploading it it's almost like TMI, right? It could lead to additional questions. So do not upload copies of invoices. Let USAC come back and request that if they need it. And probably 90% of the time, they'll go ahead and process a bearer without requiring additional documentation. All right, so again, just kind of a best practice. Okay, couple of things here, and I'm going to update this slide. I updated it for the schools this morning. A few things that I realized I want to point out. All right, a couple of things with this bearer portal. It is great. It does error checking. So if you, let's say that your 12 months worth of service, all right, let's say the total cost without any E-rate discounts is $12,000. When we file the bearer, all right, we put in what we call the pre-discount amount. What did you actually pay, all right, for that 12 months worth of service? You put in that total. Now, when you filed the 471, if you said, okay, this service is $1,000 a month, 12 months, $12,000, if you put in $12,050, you're going to get an error message. All right, because the pre-discount amount that you enter on the bearer cannot exceed at all, even a penny, what you originally put on the 471. All right, so that's one of the big gotchas for a lot of folks. So even if you did pay, above that, you have to decrease it, and the max you can put is what you originally put on that 471. Now, of course, if you put on the 471, it's $12,000, and maybe because we've seen this happen, maybe there's a month where you weren't invoiced or not fully invoiced. So instead of it being 12,000, it was only 11,500. you put in 11,500, right? What were you actually invoiced to up to the amount that you listed on that 471? And again, let me know if you have questions there. Now, on the bear form, if you have multiple funding requests, all right, maybe you have a funding request, an FRN, say for the branch circuits, maybe there's that FRN for the hotspot for the bookmobile, all right, you can put all of those on the same bear form, even if it's, two different vendors, all right, that's not an issue. If you applied for both category 1 and category 2, again, you could put both, all those FRNs on the same form. The only thing that I would recommend, though, if it's something that we know is kind of problematic to get reimbursed, the biggest that we see is if you applied for basic maintenance under category 2. There are some reasons because there are some additional rules around basic maintenance that we have currently, and it basically gets a lot of scrutiny. So if you did apply for something classified as basic maintenance on the 471, make sure put that request on its own bear form. All right, because again, some of these can take months. I've seen them take anywhere from 3 to 6 months, to go through review and then get paid out. And that single item could hold up all of your other reimbursements. All right, so again, I really stress if it's basic maintenance, put it on its own bear form. Do that separately. Now, within the portal, in the invoicing portal, we do see a lot of the functionality that we see under Epic. So, you can go back and very easily search for submitted forms. You can look at pending tasks. So if you start a bear form and you realize, okay, I don't have the correct dollar amount for this funding request, you can save the information, get out of the portal, come back later, click on pending tasks, and pick up where you left off. All right, it's not, you don't have to start all over again. And then we also see pending inquiries. So with this new invoicing portal, similar to 471, that PIA review, you may get review questions on a bear. And the inquiries, if you applied for the emergency connectivity fund, it looks very similar to that system. All right, so it's different from what we get with the the E-rate 471 review. All right, but you'll be able to go in, click on communications, and respond to the reviewer. And again, if you go out to that resource page, it'll step you through that. All right, so it does give you real-time status reports. So you can look up, so where's my application? Okay, oh, I hadn't submitted it yet. It's listed as incomplete. It's certified. Has it been processed? Meaning that USAC has finished the review and they initiated the payment. Or was this something that maybe you went ahead and submitted, then realized that there was an issue and you had to cancel it. All right, but it's going to give you that real-time status information. The other nice piece compared to the old system, we can see the date that the bear was paid. So if you need to go back, it's like, okay, where's that reimbursement? When did this money, show up in our account? You can see that, right? So one of the pitfalls, with this system, let's say you're putting multiple funding requests on the application. It always defaults to the current funding year, right? Well, most of the bears that we're filing are for 2024. We're in 2025. So for every funding request, and I get caught by this all the time, all right? Each funding request, let's say you go ahead and you add the first one. Maybe you have 3 of them, all right, to list on the form. You add the first one. You go to add the second one, you have to go up, change the funding year again. So in this case, 2024, it'll then show you, okay, here are the funding requests that, where there's no bears, no reimbursements filed yet, all right? Each and every one, you have to do that first, indicate the funding year. And like I said, it's one of those kind of little gotchas, more of an irritation. It's not hard, but it's more of an irritation. Right now, again, like I said, I'm going to be updating the slide here. One of the other things, I had someone call me early yesterday morning where they wanted to file their bear form actually for 2025, our current funding year, for some equipment. So if it's that one time, that non-recurring, you don't have to wait until the end of the funding year to file to ask for the reimbursement. You can do that once, the equipment's, you've received it, you paid the invoice, right? You can go ahead and file that reimbursement form. You don't have to wait. But the issue here is each year, service providers have to file what's called the SPAC form, right? E-rate form for everything. So the SPAC is a service provider annual certification. And it means exactly what the name implies. Service providers every year, if they want to participate in E-rate, have to file this annual certification, certifying that, yes, we want to continue participating in the program. We're going to obey the rules. All right. So if you go to file, say, for a 2025 funding request, but the service provider hasn't filed that SPAC yet, that funding request won't show up as an option for you to file for reimbursement. All right, it's a kind of a gotcha. All right, so you can then reach out to the service provider, contact me. I can reach out, Christine, or I can reach out to the service provider to say, hey, you need to get this done. All right, it is one of those things. We have lots of conversations with USAC and the FCC because we've had issues where it's taken months and months and months to convince a service provider to go in and do that. And in the meantime, we can't get our money. All right. So let me show you here. Let's see if I can get into it. A quick way, because again, the phone call I got that I received yesterday. If you go into the portal, okay, go into Epic. If you click where it says records, all right, lots of information underneath there. All right, you can click on service provider. All right, now the easiest thing is you can put in the service provider name or their SPIN, that service provider identification number. All right, and several ways that you can get that number. All right, but if you see your service provider here in the list, you can just click on the name of the provider. And what you're looking for is where it says FCC Form 473 SPAC. It's going to show you each funding year for which the annual certification has been submitted and approved. So if you're filing this for 2025 and 2025 is not listed, that FRN is not going to show up in the BEAR portal. All right. But it also shows you the name, all the contact information for that provider. All right. And this would be the person that is responsible for all things E-rate for that company. So this would be the first place you would want to check. Is that what's going on? But just so you know, if funding requests aren't showing up in the BEAR, this is typically the number one issue.
Exactly. And Lori, just to kind of jump ahead to the 470 training next week, you could put, must put your SPAC number on your bid, must be current in filing your SPACs, etc. You can put, that as part of your evaluation matrix, just to try to avoid that. But again, if you do find a reason that things are held up because of SPAC, let Lori or I know. Lori's really good at getting them to do stuff.
Yeah, sometimes if Christine or I call and say, this is the state E-rate coordinator, it sometimes gets their attention a little bit. I've even pulled out, if you don't get this done, I'm reporting you to the FCC because you're holding up, basically risking harm to this applicant. All right. So so let us know. We can reach out to them for you. All right, but again, we are seeing that happening a lot, especially with the current funding year. But Christine is correct. You can put that as a bid requirement. I already recommend, that vendors must have a SPIN, a service provider identification number, in order for the bid to be considered, right? Because some vendors, it may be, maybe a company that just found out about E-rate, and it's maybe we should look into this, but they haven't gone through the process to apply for a SPIN. So you can make that a requirement, right? Or at least give you evidence that they've started that process. So a lot of that you could put on the 470. We'll cover that in the 470 training though. All right, so that's two of the kind of pitfalls. The third one is around the banking form. Now, if you only receive discounted bills so that your service provider files the SPI, this is not an issue because you're not filing a bear form to begin with. But if you are going to file a bear, for some funding request, USAC has to know your banking information. So there is a form out there called the Form 498. For most of us, this form became available in 2016. And again, for most of us, it was a one and done. We fill out the form, here's the banking information, and luckily we don't change banks that often, right? So it's sitting out there, no need to touch it. Now, if there is a change to your information, like what if you did change banks? What if your, your financial, your fiscal contact has changed? You would want to go in and update that form, especially now if your contact changed, that's not as big of an issue. But if your banking information has changed, you definitely need to go in and update that. All right. Now, with this banking form, the 498, we do not go in and file a new form. You have to go in and modify the current one. All right. Because you can only have one approved 498 at a time. So you have to go in and modify that existing form. All right. Here is the bit of a gotcha. SAM.gov. Many of you are familiar with that, where especially during, during the COVID pandemic, with the Emergency Connectivity Fund, in order to receive, the federal funds that came from the Treasury, we had to register at SAM.gov. All right. SAM.gov issued, once that was approved, something called a UEI. Sorry for all the acronyms here. It's a unique entity identifier. All right. Well, currently, under the current rules, I'm going to say technically, E-rate does not require a SAM.gov registration. However, USAC went ahead on the 498. They've added the SAM.gov UEI field, and they made it a required field. All right. So what that means for us is if you need to modify, make any change to that 498 form, as simple as changing a contact, the contact information. If you open up that form and, need to make a correction, a modification, right? You have to be registered, and the registration has to be current in order for the modification to be allowed. So while program rules say SAM.gov is not required for E-rate, it, I guess, technically is, because now it's this required field on this form. All right. We don't feel the pinch until, or unless we have to modify this 498. All right. That's when you're required to have that current UEI. Now with SAM.gov, my understanding, I'm not a SAM.gov expert, but my understanding is you do have to go in annually and renew that. All right. That is not a one and done type situation. You do have to renew that. Okay. So again, I don't mean to belabor. It's just that this has caused a lot of heartburn for a lot of folks. All right. Because if your SAM.gov has lapsed, you need to go in, get that in good standing, then go back and update the 498. And like I said, where it's a real issue is if you've changed banks, because you can't put in the banking information until you fix the SAM.gov. All right. So again, those are the pitfalls I want to make you aware of. All right. Now, a couple of places where you can find out, do I still need to file a bear? Has everything been dispersed? Where does it stand? One of the places, USAC has what's called open data, their databases, that you can go out and you can search. Open data, bear information or reimbursement information is a good site. I recommend using that. I always recommend the E-rate Central site. All right, so that's another good site. I've shared that previously. Let me know. I can show that to you again. But you can go look, per funding year, how many funding requests have 486 filed, which we'll be talking about. Have all the funds been dispersed? Again, gives you that really quick, update, what's outstanding. Something to make you aware of, this is something that we saw a lot last year. We're still seeing some of this, the service certification. So this is received if you received those discounted bills, so that your vendor, your service provider, is filing for the reimbursement. all right, the SPI, that service provider invoice. So basically USAC, and this doesn't happen with every SPI, but USAC will do a spot check, right? They'll send you this service certification. They're just trying to verify, okay, this vendor said that, that they discounted your bill, and that, yes, they certified that you paid your non-discount portion. Well, you need to prove that indeed happened. All right. So just be on the lookout. You'll get an email. It will let you know that you have like 7 to 15 days. It varies, to get this information back. All right. Now, only applicants that have full rights in the portal can sign these. If you have a consultant, consultants can't file these or sign them. A consultant can upload it for you, but they cannot sign it for you. All right. Here's the other part. It has to be a full right user. I've seen this on the school side. Well, maybe, the school treasurer, right? You would think, well, they have the authority to sign this. Well, if that treasurer doesn't have an Epic account with full rights, they're not going to accept that treasurer's signature. Same thing, all right? If your fiscal officer doesn't have a portal account, all right, then whoever does have that full rights would need to sign it. All right, again,
Lori,
just go
one
ahead.
of the things that we've seen with libraries, at least recently, is if you have not gone to the point of putting in a full rights user in the invoicing module, you might not even get this notification, which causes problems with the funding as well. So
That's a good
when
point.
you're going in, make sure you have someone designated as full rights for the invoicing module.
Yeah, and so and thank you, Christine, that's a good point. So giving those full rights, it may say, bear/SPI. We as applicants can't file the SPI form, but with this new invoicing module, all right, the Epic invoicing, you can go in and see any SPIs that were filed, where you were listed as the billed entity on that. All right. In fact, that's where if you get these service requests, this service certification, you would go into the Epic invoicing to upload the signed document. All right. So yes, so that's a very good point. So if you've not gone in and extended the invoicing rights to at least one person with full rights, you're right. You're not even going to get the notification. And then what happens, once the time lapses, the 15 days, then the SPI just gets canceled and the service provider has to go in and refile. And sometimes it can be a bit of an irritation for them, and understandably. All right. So again, just a heads up there. This is what this form looks like, just to give you the heads up. Again, they're going to want to know, did you pay your, it's not a simple yes or no. Did you pay your non-discount portion? They're going to want to know the date it was paid, the check number, all right, some detail there. It may ask for, sometimes the service provider will go ahead and fill in things like the 471 number, the funding request number. If they don't, then you would have to provide that. All right. And then down at the bottom, you'll see a place where the signature is. And again, it would have to be that full right user who is an employee for the library system. If you get these and you're not quite sure what to do with it, let me know. All right. Any questions on 2024? I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you. Okay, let's start talking about 25. So updates and where are we at in the process? So 2025 funding year, services that started July 1, 2025, going through June 30th of 2026. All right, but remember, if you were applying for the equipment, you could have started, the internal connections. You could have, received that equipment as early as April 1st of 2025. All right, and then you would have until September 30th of 2026 to get the equipment and complete the installation. You're going to hear that several times. Okay, here's the yucky part for 2025. It is what it is. We're sad about it, but so all of the information here. So for 2025, the FCC Commission at the time approved off-premise Wi-Fi hotspots. All right, eligible under E-rate. It was also bus Wi-Fi. Bus Wi-Fi was actually approved starting in 2024. All right, so 2024 and then the 2025 funding year. But the off-premise hotspots, all right, started with the 2025 funding year. All right, so it was approved for 2025. A lot of our libraries, moved forward and applied for this. All right, well, at the September 30th FCC board meeting, because the FCC commission presidentially appointed, I'm not getting political at all here, but it's a new commission. All right. And so this new commission has rescinded that decision. So moving forward, as I'm currently now, hotspots, those off-premise hotspots are not eligible under E-rate. Okay, so that's being applied to the 2025, this current funding year. So if you applied for that, you're not going to get that funded. You're not going to see a funding letter. Okay, we've been told that the funding request will be denied. We're not sure when that's going to happen, but we know it will. All right, and and just so you understand the reasoning behind it, in the Telecommunication Act, that's what gave us the E-rate program, right? Telecommunication Act came into being in 1996, and there's language there that says that this is for that off-premise is not eligible. All right, that's been the E-rate standing rule. But with what we saw with the pandemic and the Emergency Connectivity Fund, ECF, going away, and during ECF, we were able to use those funds to put those hotspots in our patrons' hands, and the districts, sending these home with students. Okay, but that has been rescinded. It is not eligible. Now, I do want to make an important distinction here. All right, the very last bullet, it says this does not apply to hotspots used for bookmobiles or kiosks. All right, so the Telecommunication Act says, it's only eligible for on-premise. Well, a bookmobile or a kiosk is considered a library premise, right? You're conducting library business. So those hotspots have been for some time eligible and will continue to be eligible. All right. So again, if it is supporting your bookmobile, a remote or traveling kiosk, those remain eligible. All right. So as I mentioned, these existing funding requests, that we put on the 2025 471 will be denied. We don't know yet the timing on that. Just start preparing for it now. These are some bullet items that Christine sent out to the listserv, and it bears repeating. All right, go back and reread your contracts. A lot of applicants said, this is dependent on E-rate funding. Okay, if you're basically if your 471 decision, what you listed on the 471 was based on the Oakland 470, all right, which many of you used. It saved us having to go out and, go through that bid process. There was language on that 470 that said, provide details for optional continuation or termination of the contract in the event that the FCC off-premise hotspot program is either terminated or altered. All right, so there was language there on that 470, bottom line. Okay, but reach out to the vendor if you have already started that contract. If you're only going to do this, or you were only going to do this if E-rate approved it, right? Go back and check with them. Now, I heard from some library systems where I will not give the provider name, but a provider, this was maybe a month ago, where it started, where they were, it's like, okay, this is kind of dragging out. We've not received a funding decision yet, pushing for, signing a rider. Okay, and I've got a copy of that rider, and reading through it said, that signing this rider, I agree that this is not contingent on E-rate funding, that I agree to move forward with the service, even if E-rate doesn't fund it. Okay, so if you've gotten one of those riders, you could go back and have a conversation with the with the provider. Now, if this is something that you're going, that you decided I'm going to do this, whether E-rate funds it or not a problem, right? You're already paying for it and you agreed to that. Okay, this is only if you're only going to move forward if this was funded. Sorry to belabor the point here. All right, but how many people are going to get caught in this? For the schools, because the bus Wi-Fi actually started in 2024, a lot of the school districts signed, like 3-year contracts. All right. And so, that they initiated it 24. Okay, we're good to apply for this for 25. And now some of them are stuck. And this is impacting some of our, our large urban school districts. All right. So it is what it is. Our job is simply to inform you. But let Christine know if you have any questions with this. Okay, so as we talk a little bit more about 25, I'm a numbers geek. I like data. I just wanted to show you this is a big thing, at the national level, like SECA, the State E-Rate Coordinators Alliance, and I'm sure ALA does the same thing, where we look at, comparing state to state, how much funding, did you request, how much was approved. All right, so this is what it looks like for our state. I actually broke it out, by applicant type. All right, so consortium, Oakland is a big part of that $3.9 million. All right, our independent libraries versus library systems, if it's an independent school versus school district. And we expect that the lion's share, goes to school districts. But as a state, total just a little over $96 million. All right, so again, it's a good way to see how E-rate really impacts our state. Now, I took this a little further. It's, well, okay, well, how does this look when we look at the different types of service? All right. And again, as you would expect, the data transmission and or internet access, that's bandwidth and internet, again, is the lion's share. But we can see that, internal connections. All right. That's that buying the equipment, router switches, access points, a huge number there, higher than we normally see, because 2025 was year 5 of the category 2 budget cycle. So a lot of places were, a lot of applicants were trying to use up those Cat 2 funds. All right, but the biggie for our libraries, our schools as well. But if we look at hotspot services and equipment, and then the bus Wi-Fi, we can see that for bus Wi-Fi was about, half $500,000, but it was a little over 1.3 million for the hotspot service, impacting 54 different funding requests, which equates to about 54 library systems or independent libraries. All right, so again, that's a pretty big number when we look at, comparing this state to state. Okay, another way to look at the data, but the reason I'm stressing this, 96 million. Okay, well, if we back out that, 1.8 million that earmarked for hotspots and the bus Wi-Fi, all right, that gives us about $94 million. Well, to date, 73 billion, 73 and a half has been committed so far. That means that there's still about another $20 million yet to be funded. This year, we did see some issues getting funding decisions. USAC started referring to, some of these applications that were just sitting out there as, black holes, right? It was an issue this year. Okay, so you want to make sure that you go into Epic. If you've not received all of your funding decisions, very important that you go into Epic. You can drill down to your 471s and check the status, because there may be some inquiry, right? If the status says outreach, there may be some question sitting out there that USAC's waiting for you to respond to, and that's why you've not received the funding letter. All right, so just go back and check that just to make sure, are they waiting on you? All right, but again, it'll tell you that. Now, to date, the reason I pulled this data the way I did, all of these, 3,154 funding requests. That's less the, the Wi-Fi and bus, the bus Wi-Fi and the hotspots. 2,833 have been funded. That sounds amazing. All right, but remember, the next step, once you receive a funding letter, is filing the Form 486. So the 486, this is where you're indicating that, yes, we moved forward, to use a service, or we intend to use a service, and you verify that, yes, I put on the 471 that July 1st was my start date, and you confirm that that is still the case. All right, so that's the first purpose of the 486. The other purpose is, this is where we indicate whether you are You indicate if you're SEPA compliant or not. All right. Now, another reason this is important is if you apply for internet access, all right, so just commodity internet, not that does not mean the raw circuit. I'll explain that. All right, but if it's internet access or anything under category 2, you have to be SEPA compliant. All right, so if that's the case, if you applied, if you did apply for Cat 2, if you do have an internet access request, then you would indicate that you are indeed SEPA compliant. Now, if you are a library system, where because Oakland provides the circuit, it could be to your main library, wherever that DMARC, whatever was designated. All right, since Oakland provides that, our library systems then provide the point-to-point circuits, those circuits down to the branches. Okay, so those branches, typically those circuits, it is just that raw circuit. There is no internet cost or internet service tied into that. All right, so if it really is just that circuit, there is no requirement to be SEPA compliant for that. All right, and Christine, thank you for reminding me of that yesterday when we were talking about the 486. All right, so again, if you have questions on that, let me know. Now, it is important when we talk about 2025, maybe you've received your funding letter. I'm seeing this a lot with internal connections, all right, when you're purchasing equipment. All right, let's say that you ask for service from a specific vendor, and then the vendor has since come back saying, we've discovered we can't provide this equipment for whatever reason. All right, so we do have the option of changing providers. There's all kind of rules around it. So if you're in that situation, let me know, and I can walk you through that. All right, but E-rate rules do allow us to change providers if the original provider cannot provide the service. Okay, the other thing to be mindful of, and again, something we're seeing a lot, because there was such a delay in receiving funding letters, that if you waited until the funding letter came out to start the purchasing process, let's say for some access points, it's been months and months since you originally applied for this. All right, so maybe the model that you listed is no longer available, or maybe it's nearing end of life, and you decide, okay, I don't want to start out with an out-of-date piece of equipment. So you are allowed to change models. All right, you could go with a more current model or something that's more readily available. We call that making a service substitution. All right, and E-rate process, E-rate form for everything. So this is allowed as long as whatever you're substituting for, all right, so if it's you originally asked for an access point, then you can substitute with another access point. All right, it has to be like for like. All right, but again, that is allowed. Now, just keep in mind that if you go with a new model of, let's say, again, an access point, and that new model, let's say it costs $50 more per device, E-rate's not going to cover that $50. Anything that's over the original cost, right? That difference would be out of pocket. But then, of course, let's say it's $50 less, you're not going to get the extra, right? You're going to get, you have to show, here's the cost for this substituted item, and you'll get funded, based on its actual cost up to the original amount. All right. But again, just let you know that, this is allowed, because again, we're seeing it a lot right now. Okay. Another thing here, I talked about how the 471 review process has been a little slow. We've also seen it a little bit on the BEAR review. Most of them go through pretty quick, all right? But we've had some issues. If you filed a BEAR and it's been 60 days, since you submitted it, and there's been no movement, you can let me know, let Christine know, and we can reach out to to USAC, all right, and just kind of ask what's going on there. Again, let me know if you have questions. Okay, now it is very important that if you have received your funding letter, that you go back and look at that funding, the funding decisions very closely. Now, when it's called the FCDL, Funding Commitment Decision Letter, when that's issued, you receive an email, all right? The account administrator will be included, will be CC'd on the email. If you have a consultant, someone filing for you, whoever's listed as the contact on the 471 will also get this email. All right, but they'll have an attachment, actually two attachments. One's a spreadsheet, kind of hard to decipher, what was funded and, all of the detail. But there's a very pretty PDF document that's very easy to read. All right, you want to check that PDF document over very closely. All right, because sometimes you may have made a mistake on the 471 that, USAC goes ahead and processes the application as is, and you wind up with reduced funding. Okay, we see that happen every year. Right, so it's really important that, as quick as possible, once you receive the funding letter, check it over. And the reason, again, I stress this, is you have 60 days from the date the letter was issued, not when you finally went in the system or opened the email and finally read it. It's the date that USAC issues it. All right, so you have 60 days to file an appeal, to say, I made a clerical error, this is what happened. All right, and then you hope for the best. And a lot of this can be corrected during an appeal. All right, but if you go beyond the 60 days, first you have to file an appeal to explain why you missed the 60-day and you're filing this late. First, you have to get over that hurdle. And then if it's granted that, yes, you're going to get extra time for whatever reason, then make your case as to, making the correction. Okay. But historically, if it's past this deadline, it has to be based on some horrific incident. And I've seen some of these, where, I mean, horrible things happened, that caused, the deadline to be missed. I won't get into those incidences. All right, but it takes something really bad, all right, to get these through. Okay, so enough about that. The 486, I mentioned if you receive the funding letter, you need to get that filed, especially if you're getting discounted bills, because the service provider cannot file the SPI until the 486 is filed and approved. Okay, now if you check all the correct boxes on the 486, it's pretty much an automatic approval. It takes about 2 to 3 minutes to receive an email saying, yep, here's your notification letter. Notification letter is a good thing. It means it was approved. All right. If you don't get the notification letter within about 3-4 minutes, then chances are you checked the wrong certifications. One of the kind of holdups with the 486, if you accidentally, said that I'm not SEPA compliant when it was a service that required SEPA compliance, USAC will put that into review. Then they'll come back and say, okay, did you really mean to answer the question this way? All right. But again, just go back and check that. Now, one of the things I mentioned, you have to be SEPA compliant for anything under Cat 2. Now, for internal connections, the 486 deadline, again, this one's a little bit of a moving target. Okay, it's tied to one of two things: the date of your funding letter or the service start date, whichever is the later date. Okay, so what I mean by that is a lot of funding letters went out prior to July 1st. Well, that's a service start date, right, for our services. All right, the earliest date that we can put on the form anyway. All right, so if your funding letter was dated anything before, on or before July 1st, all right, your 486 deadline, the countdown starts with July 1st. All right, regardless of that date, it could be, April 15th or June 15th, doesn't matter. All right, we all get the same countdown. All right, so again, if it's dated on or before, then the deadline to file the 486 for like recurring service would be October 29th. Okay, that's 120 days from July 1st, the day after the 24 fair deadline. All right, now I said it's due, either the date of the funding letter or when the service starts. Well, what if it's internal connections? All right, and you were waiting until you received a funding letter to buy the equipment. Maybe you've ordered it, but you've not received it yet. Okay, so maybe that doesn't happen until November 1st. So if it's November 1st, you could wait to file the 486 and the deadline would be 120 days from November 1st. Now, that gets really confusing. Sorry, it's just the way it is. And if that service start date changes because you would have put July 1 on the original 471 application, you would want to make sure and change that start date on the 486. All right. Here's the thing though, with internal connections, even if you've not received the equipment yet, there's no harm to go ahead. If you've gotten, if you've received the funding letter, go ahead and get the 486 filed for everything. All right. So if something happens where, maybe you decide, okay, we're not going to purchase this equipment, it's on back order. I'm just going to file again for it, for 26. Filing that 486 doesn't, doesn't force your hand. You can still cancel that funding request. All right. It just saves you the heartburn of forgetting to file the 486 later. Because if you forget the 486, it gets really nasty. USAC can adjust, you miss the deadline, they can adjust your service start date and lop off, say, several months worth of service. Not to belabor the point, but it's not fun when that happens.
That is a point that cannot actually be belabored too much. Because
Good.
I've seen libraries who have lost money for not filing their 486 in a timely fashion. And as you say, that 486 can be filed in anticipation of receiving things. You've got the FCDL, you can go ahead and do the 486, assuming that everything is going to go as planned. And if things don't later on, then yeah, no big deal. But it is a big deal if you forget and
yes,
lose your money.
Yeah. And those conversations are never fun to have. It's never fun to have. I'll get panic phone calls saying, Lori, I just realized I just got this revised funding letter saying that my service start date instead of July 1 is now, January 1st. What happened? Well, you missed the 486 deadline. So now you've lost 6 months worth of funding. All right. I actually had someone a couple of years ago, they didn't think about this until March. So 9 months into the funding year, they went ahead and filed the 486. They lost 9 months worth of funding. It's a very quick, easy form to file. We've actually asked the FCC, it's like, why do we have to fill this out? We've already told you, when the service will start. You just like with ECF, they ask the SEPA question on the 471 itself, but the answer has been no. So we'll keep fighting the fight. All right, just get it filed. Like I said, there are no repercussions if you submit it and then you change your mind about service or equipment down the road. Okay, let's talk about 26. So, and what's new? All right, so every year, we wait for this admin window. All right, this is a big deal for schools, probably more than libraries, because this is when the schools start going in and updating their enrollment and their lunch information. But it does impact our libraries because, of course, your discount rate is based on the information that the schools enter, right, for that enrollment and lunch info. All right, so you're going to feel the impact. All right, but this admin window is scheduled to open on October 15th. So, if you go in and you start making changes to some of your, library sites, it's going to get reset and you'll have to go in and do it again. Wait at least until October 15th. Okay, so there's always, like I said, it opens about mid-October, again, October 15th, and then it closes 3 to 5 days before the Form 471 window opens. All right, because what happens is whatever information that you update, a lot of that will pre-populate on the Form 471. All right, so USAC discovered our first year of the portal that, if we don't lock down the information, we have a major problem. Some of us still remember that very first year. All right, so it closes, like I said, several days before the 471 window opens, locks everything down. Okay, even adding users. All right, so keep in mind if you need to add, if you've changed directors, if any users in the portal that you need to update, it's easier to get it done during the admin window. You could still add users after the close of the window, but you would have to reach out to USAC and ask them to create the user for you. All right, takes a little more work. All right, so again, that's another thing that you would do during this admin window. For our libraries, if you are planning on applying for, or think you even might, All right. The big thing that that you would need to do during the admin window is going in and confirming square footage for each of your library sites. If you're an independent library, all right, you put in the square footage for your single library. All right. If it's a library system, all right, make sure the square footage is updated for the main library, all the branches. If you have a bookmobile, you can put in the square footage for that. All right. I've gotten the question before, well, how do we know that? You can go out and measure, all right? Just put in the square footage. Now, if you do either change the square footage or you add, you add new information, just be prepared. It's a standard review question, during the 471 review to say, okay, you said here's the square footage, you need to prove this. Now, there's a number of different ways to do that. You can go to the IMLS site. They have a great database where you can look up your libraries and it'll show, what's the square footage that was reported, in the system there in that database. If it's new construction, it could be, information from the architect, from the construction, contractor, right? There are a number of different ways to get that square footage, but it's a guarantee that USAC's going to want proof of that. All right. It could be something where you provide documentation information to Christine or Don, say Don can write the validation letter for you, but we need the documentation to say, okay, this is how you came up with the number. All right. But again, just be prepared for that. Okay. You also, during this admin window, go in and look, are all of your library sites listed, right? All of the branches, check the street addresses, is all of that correct? A lot of this information has been in the portal for years, right? And a lot of the information migrated over in 26 was the first, or excuse me, 16, sorry, 16 was the first year that we had the portal. So a lot of this was simply pulled over from old Bessie, right? The old system and never got touched to clean that data up. So again, check the street addresses. Also, do you have facilities, something like what we call a NIP, a non-instructional facility? It could be a totally separate admin building, a data center, something that's not open to the to your patrons. All right. So again, make sure if this site, if this building's receiving E-rated service, all right, if you're providing a circuit to that building, they need to be listed in the portal. All right. So again, can't stress that enough. So you can go in and get that information updated. Okay, something that I want to make you aware of, and I don't know, when we look at, how many libraries apply for Category 2, again, as we saw, a lot more schools apply for this, but we do have some libraries, utilizing basic maintenance. So each year, I'm going to get a little ahead of my slides here, but each year the FCC releases what we call the eligible service list. It always starts out in draft form. So it's, here, this is what we're proposing to be eligible for the next funding year. All right. Most years there are very few changes. There may be just a little language tweak, maybe a definition or whatever. This year it's pretty impactful. All right. So the biggest thing that we see right off the bat, well, first off, hotspots for patron use, the off-premise and the bus Wi-Fi has been removed, right? Since that's no longer eligible. So let's get that out there first. All right. Here's this other item that we very much appreciate. I'll put it that way. So currently, if the basic maintenance definition. So basic maintenance, if you don't apply for Cat 2, you can go, grab something to drink if you're not planning on applying for Cat 2. This is all around basic maintenance, all right, a Category 2 service. So the current definition, all right, for basic maintenance, basically you can get this in two flavors, all right? One is what we call in-person service. This is where you have a technician come on site, to, repair a piece of eligible equipment, things like router switches, access points, structured cabling. All right. But this is based on time and material type contracts. All right. And what I mean by this is you might have a contract with a company, to be able to do that type of maintenance. Maybe that contract is $10,000 for the year. Okay. And that's the quote they gave you. That's the contract that you signed, $10,000. All right. Well, E-rate does not pay for insurance policies. So with the in-person service, it's based on time and material. So you have to keep basically a log, right? So, when did the occurrence happen? When did this take place? When did this happen? What was the make and model of the piece of equipment? How much time did it take? All of that kind of detail. All right. So let's say during the course of that, that 12-month service, maybe you only had one occurrence and the time and material was only $2,000. All right. E-rate's going to base your reimbursement on $2,000, the portion that you actually used. If you had no occurrence at all during the year, you're not going to qualify for any reimbursement for that type contract. Okay. The other option is it really is a very basic level of maintenance. It's the remote service. I know for years, I don't know if it's even still available, but Cisco had something called SmartNet Basic, and it was this most basic level. All right, where everything's remote. All right, it's you have a help desk that you can go to, or a help desk you can call if you have an issue. You could also go out to the site to download, firmware updates, patches, that kind of thing. All right, but it's all remote, it's all online. All right, so again, that's the other option. Um, this can also this type very basic service can get rolled into if you go to renew say your access point license. All right, so again, that can be rolled in. Okay, so this would be a 12-month, right? And there's all kinds of rules around basic maintenance. So again, this is the current definition. So this draft, okay, why this is so important, that draft ESL, because there's been so much confusion with basic maintenance that the FCC is looking at, okay, how should we handle this? All right. So as I mentioned, this has been a big issue if you go to, if you request renewal license for those access points. All right. Because renewal license typically include both the right to use client. All right, it's the operating system in essence, for those access points, or it could be tied to your wireless controller. But they also typically, the manufacturer also rolls in that very basic, that remote service, right? So if you need, you're renewing the subscription. So what if you need to do a firmware update and you're doing say another 5-year subscription? All right, so it rolls all that in together. So the way this has worked is if there was support rolled into that service, then you, by definition, you had to request the funding under basic maintenance. So where it's an issue, when you're buying brand new access points, let's say you go ahead, when you buy the access points, you go ahead and, purchase a 3-year subscription for the license. All right, no problem. New equipment, here's the right to use license. It's simply the operating system. All right. You could go ahead and pay for all 3 years up front. It fit under internal connections. All right. You could go ahead, pay the full cost, pay all 3 years. Go ahead and file the bear form if you're paying in full, or the service provider could file the SPI. All right, for that 3-year, 5-year term, whatever you purchased. All right. The renewals work completely different under the basic maintenance rules. And I apologize if you don't apply for CAT 2, like I said, but I'm looking at the list. I know the ones of you that typically do. All right. So when you go to do that renewal, if it includes the support, all right, let's say you do a 5-year subscription. If you go, you have to pay for all 5 years up front, but because support is tucked in there, you have to get this funded under basic maintenance. And where this has become such an issue is, okay, I paid my, let's say $10,000, for this multi-year subscription. I had to pay it all up front. But because this falls under maintenance, it's treated as, in this case, a 5-year contract. All right. So what that means is you have to pay all of that cost up front, but then you have to do a pro rata, and you treat it like a multi-year contract. So if it's that 10,000, you could only ask for 2,000, 1 year's cost on the 471, and you do that for 5 years. All right, and it's been so confusing. It's been a mess, plain and simple. So all of that explanation to say that the FCC is looking at how do we improve How do we simplify? And what they're proposing to do is for that very basic, that remote type service, getting that allowed under internal connections. So whether it's a renewal license that includes support, or maybe maybe you just want to buy just that very, remote service, a service agreement, all right, and ask for a 3-year or a 5-year. If this is approved, that would all be eligible under internal connections. Most of us, when we saw this, did a happy dance because again, this has caused so much heartburn. All right. So again, this is what they're proposing. And I apologize, there's no quick, easy way to explain this. Not that I've come up with yet anyway. All right. So if this is approved, we'll basically that fixed contract, for that on-site time and material, we'll still have that eligible under basic maintenance of internal connections, what all the rules that apply to that, right? But we won't have to, worry about that pro rata of trying to spread out those requests over that multi-year subscription. Keeping our fingers crossed. Okay. I am going to point out here a couple more things. Sorry. USAC's guidance, because this has been so messy, that their guidance has been when you go to file a 470 to ask for this. Oftentimes when you're filing that bidding form, that 470, you don't know for sure, right, under the current definitions, does this fit under internal connections or is it basic maintenance? So USAC's guidance has been ask for it under both service types. Okay. The reason I am stressing this is this is still in draft. There's this comment period that we have to get through. And the current deadlines right now will take us through October 30th. So we know we're not going to have an answer, right, before October 30th. So and I'm doing 470 training next week. So the current 470, if you go to file, for a license renewal before a decision is made, and if this has been approved, getting the application, covered or getting that, I should updated, sorry. Go ahead and my guidance next week will be, file this under both internal connections and basic maintenance under the current rules, all right, until we get a hard decision. That also brings up a point, sorry. If you get the burning desire to go ahead and file a 470, right now, the patron hotspots, the off-premise hotspots, that's still showing up on the 470. Okay, so don't get excited that it's listed there. The form just hasn't been updated yet. Just in case you don't, attend 470 training. Okay, one other thing that's on this draft version of the ESL, we do have some libraries that apply for MIBS. This is that Managed Internal Broadband Service. A lot of our schools use this. All right, but like I said, we do have some library systems that use this. So MIBS, this is where you pay a service provider, a third-party company, to do that day-to-day management operation of your network. All right, of your LAN, your WAN, all right, and it's this monthly recurring service. Okay, so what they're looking at is moving forward, they're asking some very specific questions. Should we continue funding MIBS? As it's currently listed. Are there substantial benefits for funding MIBS? Are there cost savings? MIBS was really designed for our smaller school districts, our library systems. I'm a former IT director from a school district where I was a staff of one. I see the same thing with our library systems, our smaller library systems, right, where we have very limited tech support, right? So this was a good way to get that outside tech support covered, right? That day-to-day, like I said, that management, that monitoring. What if there's, you need to change a configuration on an access point to improve the coverage? What if, one of your switches, requires a configuration change, right? Having the on staff folks that have the technical knowledge to do that can be a challenge. So again, that was the whole purpose of having MIBS, but they're going back, they're looking at, do we continue funding this? And like I said, this is a big deal for especially our schools, but again, can impact our libraries as well. All right. So again, they're looking at, should we continue it? One of the big issues around this, because of all the problems with basic maintenance, a lot of service providers have said, okay, instead of dealing with all the issues with this license renewal, all this business, we're just going to roll that into our MIB service, and we'll just call it MIBS, managed service, right? So one of the things the FCC is looking at is, if we continue, funding MIBS, do we need to do a better job defining, right, what constitutes basic maintenance, what constitutes the MIB service. All right. So possible changes coming there. I talked about this comment period. So the initial comments, this is where it could be an individual, a library system, pardon me, can respond. It can be at the state level, it can be at the national level. So SECA, the State E-Rate Coordinators Alliance, I'm a member of that, as well as Shelby. National level comments, are being written. But again, if you feel strongly about this, you can write comments. So that initial comment deadline is October 15th. All right. Now, with the government shutdown, because a lot of the FCC staff are, on furlough, that date may get pushed back. We don't know that yet. Okay. So the way this works is there's the initial comments, and you can go out and you can see what SECA, what ALA, what the different groups are recommending. All right. So then the reply comment, you can then say, I really like ALA's comments for this reason, or I really disagree with what SECA said, on this point. All right. So it's that back and forth. So the deadlines as it stands right now for that back and forth part is October 30th. Again, just to make you aware, this is what's going on. All right, a couple more reminders here, because this was new last year. I did veterans training for schools this morning, and I had a number of folks saying, oh, I forgot this. All right. So one of the things is, if you have ineligible users, using your network, if you've got maybe a room carved out, that, is outside, of library usage. Again, I see it impacting, school districts more often. All right. But if you have that, if you have any ineligible, users access to your network, if it makes up 10% or less of your usage, all right, we don't have to report that. We don't have to treat that as ineligible service. All right. A reminder here, a bidding exemption. This exemption only applies to libraries. Schools don't get to use this. All right. But if you are looking at applying for category 2, maybe it's something where, category 2 equipment, let's say you just need, maybe 3 or 4 access points, minimal cost. You can basically pass the bidding requirement, right? As long as that, what we call the pre-discount, the actual cost, doesn't exceed $3,600. All right. And that's per library. So if you have 3 different branches, that's $3,600 per branch, per location. All right. So again, it's a really, good idea. You don't have to file the Form 470 to go out to bid. You can just reach out to a service provider. Just make sure it's a service provider that participates in E-rate and has a spin. All right. But you can go ahead and just list it on a 471 and not have to go through that bidding hurdle. Okay, now this other bidding exemption, I know some of you are quite familiar with this. This is a category 1 bidding exemption, just a reminder here. So if you are using, say for some of your smaller branches, a commercially available internet, all right? So we refer to this as CABIO, commercially available bundled internet option, all right? CABIO, a lot easier to say. But again, it's, you contact your local ISP. It's the same type, like DSL service that they would offer to a local business. All right. So again, there are some things that, some minimum requirements that you have to meet. But and if the service does, you don't have to file the 470. You still file the 471 because we have to indicate the type service, the monthly recurring cost, right? But you don't have to go out to bid. So this is typically, like a cable modem, DSL, that type service. So the minimum speeds, and anymore, this is easy to meet this part here. All right, the minimum speed has to be at least 100 meg by 10. All right, so 100 meg downstream by 10 megs upstream. All right, and like I said, most of those services anymore, well above that. The other piece here is similar to the Cat 2 exemption. Cost cannot exceed $3,600 annually per library site, per library branch. All right, so if you have that DSL, maybe it's a 500 by 50 type service, and it's $129 per month, that passes, right? That would qualify for this caveat. All right. So again, go back and look, is that a service that you're currently using, that you're planning on using, right? You would not have to file that 470. When you file the 471, right, because that's still the requirement, it's going to ask you questions. It'll say, did you file a 470? No. Okay, so what's the upload speed? What's the download speed? What's the monthly recurring cost? And the system goes out to make sure, it does this, error check to make sure that yes, you did indeed qualify, all right, to pass on the 470. But these are, yeah, very, very easy to get funded. All right, a couple of other things here, and again, this applies to the category 2. This is the C2 NIF cost allocation. It's like, what in the world does that mean? So, I think I've mentioned that if you have a building that's classified as a non-instructional facility, a separate admin building, a data center, right? Again, it's not open, for patrons to use, right? So NIFs do not qualify for Cat 2 funding. So if you wanted to buy some access points to put in that data center, all right, E-rate's not going to cover it. But let's say in the data center, your NOC is there, right? There's that wiring closet, and your core router, a core switch is there, and let's say all of your branch traffic connects back to that site, all right, and goes through that piece of shared equipment, all right. So in this case, if it's sitting in that non-instructional facility, it might, in this example of data center, all right, you could get E-rate to cover that piece of equipment, even if the staff within that facility also use that piece of equipment. This was a change last year, and again, big impact for the schools, but I also see how it could affect our libraries. The other one is around structured cabling. All right, so the FCC clarified that structured cabling, be it in a school or a library, can be connected to ineligible type equipment. All right, so E-rate covers router switches, access points, right, that connectivity equipment, but it does not cover things like security cameras, okay, that voice equipment, smoke detectors, some of that equipment that would require let's say an Ethernet drop. Okay, so what this means for us is that let's say you're running cabling, structured cabling, whether Ethernet, 6, 7, whatever you're running. It could be a fiber run, all right, but you're running this through your building. And if you happen to connect a security camera to that drop, there's no issue. Previously, you had to cost allocate, okay? Because the thinking is, if you're running that Ethernet, let's say in this case an Ethernet drop, it could still function for eligible service, right? Because maybe you're going to plug a small switch into that drop where you could also plug in an AP, or maybe it's an end user, your tablet, your laptop, all right? If you still have a desktop, right, that can still connect to get out to the internet. All right, again, I hope all that made sense. All right, but again, as long as it's still the primary purpose, it was intended, right, to to service that eligible equipment, it could also serve the ineligible items. That's a mouthful. Let me know if you have any questions. Okay, we've already talked about this. It hurts enough. All right. So even if it's, I said, if it shows up on the 470, don't get excited. It's not going to get funded for 25, nor for 26. We can still live in hope that, maybe in the future, this will change. Okay. Not going to be eligible for 26. All right, let's spend a few minutes talking about the Cat 2 budgets. All right, so our current funding year, 2025, is year 5 of the 5-year cycle. So starting with 2026, all right, all those budgets will get refreshed. All right, so if you did not use all of your Cat 2 funds, whatever was left after you filed your 471 and things got approved, anything left is going to get zeroed out. All right, 2026 will start this new 5-year cycle. Now, currently there is a budget tool out on USAC's website, one of those open data sets. But right now it's still just showing the 21 to 25, that 5-year cycle, right? It hasn't been updated yet. And my guess is they're going to wait until after the admin window, people updating, schools updating their enrollment numbers, libraries, updating square footage. Once the admin window closes, okay, then more than likely they'll open this up for the new 5-year. All right. Now, with category 2 for libraries, first off, remember you have to be SEPA compliant, right, in order to qualify for category 2. Now, SEPA compliant, it means that you are filtering. The filtering requirements, though, the FCC says, as long as you're filtering for, pornographic obscene depictions. All right. You also have to have an acceptable use policy. Sorry, went right out of my head. Like an AUP, something that says that yes, we're filtering, and if you caught getting into certain content, here are the penalties. Right? Add that to your AUP. All right. Now with filtering, and Christine, if you want to speak up here, I know Oakland offers filtering service. All right.
Mm-hmm. So we have Cisco Umbrella, and so you can control your own filtering with that. We just give you an instance of it, and Jessica is the person to talk to if you're interested in using that. It's at no cost to you. And again, Jessica's amazing at helping people work through what that means for your library and how to set it up. So definitely, you can have a very light hand on the filtering and be SEPA compliant and check that box and be eligible for all the things. So if you're considering it, let us know.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, because again, with the filtering requirements, like I said, it's filtering for obscene depictions, filtering for minors. Adults can have an override, if it's for legitimate, research, right? So oftentimes the requirements aren't as extreme as we assume them to be. All right. Now, if you're not currently SEPA compliant and decide that you are, a couple of things here. The FCC understands that sometimes that can take some time to get into place. So if you think you might decide to become SEPA compliant, you can still file a Form 470. Go ahead and get pricing for the equipment. You can even move forward and file the 471. And just communicate with the service provider that this depends on whether you buy the equipment, whether you're funded or not, or whether you move forward and become SEPA compliant, because you don't have to show or indicate your compliance until you file the 486. But on the 486, it asks a question: are you asking for a SEPA waiver because you're working at becoming SEPA compliant, but you're not there yet? And they actually give you 2 years to become compliant. All right. So this isn't something that you have to, very quickly, jump into. You've got a period of time to make that happen. All right. Now, if you do decide, if you're currently not compliant and you decide to, to make that change, you do want to document, like at the board meeting, right, when this is discussed and approved. All right. So you want to document that, keep those board minutes. Also with the AUPs, you want to keep copies of those AUPs. All right, let me know if you have questions there. All right, so this is what the budgets look like. Now, on the left-hand side, it shows, this is what, here are the budget figures from 21 to 25. Right-hand side, the new dollar amounts. All right, now we can see that under the current 5-year, it was based on $4.50 per square foot. So with libraries, if you have multiple sites, right, the system, once you go in, you plug in the square footage, for each branch location, the system just adds all of that up. So it may show, okay, you have 100,000, square feet, right? Depending on your system. And then it just does the math, right? Multiplies that by that per square foot value. All right. Now, when we look at the new budget, it's going to increase from $4.50 per square foot to $5.43. All right. So quite a jump. All right. I just wish they had rounded up. Trying to do this math in my head has been a challenge. Okay. Now, we do have what's called the funding floor. This is something that was put in place if it's a small library system or school district where there's 10 libraries or less, or 10 schools or less, where well, that's another slide. I'll show you that. But it's also this funding floor. It's sorry, confusing my slides. If you have a library site that has less than 5,558 square feet, sorry, then it's based on $30,175. All right. So again, when you do the math, if it's anything less than, so like a bookmobile, all right, it's a library site. So you would get the benefit of $30,175 in your budget for that bookmobile. All right, and then we'll talk about this exemption if you're 10 sites or less. All right, but again, just makes this very, very lucrative. Okay, this is the the exception I wanted to show you. All right, so again, if it's 10 sites or less, all right, you can do this hybrid. You get the benefit of a hybrid budget. All right, so what this looks like, we can see here that Central, our main location, East Branch and North Branch all have more than that 5,558 square feet. So it's simply, and I apologize, I need to update my slide. Okay, it's $5 and whatever. I need to update that, sorry. All right, but again, here's that budget amount, all right, that's going to get calculated for those sites. All right, but we can see that we have West Branch with 5,000 square feet and our bookmobile. All right, instead of calculating on that per square foot amount, we get the benefit of the 30,175, all right, added into our budget. So that really is quite a benefit. Okay, and then all of that just gets added up together and we get the grand total. So in this case, $236,135 and some change. Now with this, you are not required to, basically, spend this like at West Branch. You're not limited to $30,175 over the 5 years. All of that gets added up and it's a library system budget. So if you decide to spend the lion's share of that budget amount, let's say at your main library, that's perfectly fine. All right. It's a library system decision. All right. So again, just keep that in mind. Let me know if you have questions on that. And thank you for your patience. I know it's a lot of information. Now, establishing the Cat 2 budget, I mentioned with this admin window, go in, check the square footage, for each of your library sites, make sure that square footage is correct. And you have to do, if you have 5 different branches, you have to click on each one independently and enter that square footage. But then the portal, like I said, just adds everything up. Now, after the close of the window, you put this in, first it's going to say this is a forecast budget because that square footage hasn't been proven yet. You've not validated that yet. All right, so again, it's going to be listed as forecast. If you file a 471, once you certify that form, then the status will become preliminary, right? Because we had a forecast, we're expecting this to get validated and then this request to get deducted. All right, so here's this preliminary budget. Once you go through the application review, that PIA review, and they ask for proof of the numbers. All right, again, that's typically easy to show. All right, once that's been validated, then it becomes your confirmed budget. But the portal will update as you complete each of those steps. Now, I do want to stress here when we talk about these budgets, when you look at that number, it's what we call a pre-discount budget, a pre-discount price. So what that means in this example, let's say your 5-year, and again, it is a 5-year, you have 5 years, right, to spend this money. Excuse me. So let's say your budget is $204,475. All right, well, then we have to look at what's your discount rate. So in this example, let's say it's 60%. So if that's the case, if you spent up to $204,475, E-rate's going to reimburse you 60%. And then you would be responsible for the 40% for that balance. All right. Bottom line, this has caused a lot of confusion. E-rate is never going to give you, in this example, $204, $204,475. Okay, this is a pre-discount budget. And the way they make it equitable is, maybe, my budget is the 204 and change, but I'm at an 85% discount rate, right? Because maybe, the need in my area, the school district, more students qualify for the school lunch program, all right? More need there compared to maybe a neighboring library system, where maybe, higher wealth. And so they're at a 60% discount rate. All right. Again, this is how the FCC says we're making this equitable. The greater the need, the less you have to pay. So again, let me know if there are questions there. All right, just to show you here, as far as, updating that information, when you log into Epic, where you want to start, go in and first check to see what's that grand total of your square footage. To do that, when you log in under My Entities, if you're a library system, all right, the library system name is listed first. So we start by clicking there. Okay, some really good information listed once you do this. So this takes you to the library system summary page. If you're an independent library, obviously you're just going to get the information for that single building. All right. One of the first things you want to look at is the account administrator. I didn't highlight this. All right. But take a look at it. All right. It's going to say, here's the individual that's listed as the account administrator for Epic. Is that person left? Right. Do you need to update that? All right. Now, account administrators, they're the only users that can add additional users or change rights. All right. So again, it's really important to get this updated. And if you've had a change in staff, let me know and I can help you, make these changes, walk you through that. Christine or I can help you with that. There's also a general contact. Also make sure that is correct. The general contacts, even if we change account administrators, we tend to forget about going in and changing this contact as well. There are some notifications that only the general contact might receive. All right. So again, you want to make sure that that's correct. But as we look a little bit further down, here's the Cat 2 budget information. And this is the sum of square footage for all the libraries in the system. All right. So look at that grand total. Does that look correct to you? All right. If you say, well, no, that's really off. That's, the combined square footage of all of our branches, should be, 4 times that. All right. Look at that number. Okay. And then if you know that it's off, then you can go back and make those corrections. All right. Now, while we're at that summary page, you will see the option here at the top. It says Cat 2 budgets. If I click there, all right, then I have to click a second time where it says Get Cat 2 budget. All right. And then they've already added placeholders here for the 26 to 2030 budget. All right. So it's calculating currently on whatever square footage is in Epic. All right. And then once you go in and correct those numbers, right, if needed, it'll recalculate. Now, it will also show you for this current 5-year, the 2021 to 2025, what that budget amount was, all of the requests and how much, was left. And then USAC, if it hasn't happened yet, it should, once the admin window opens, remaining budget should be showing 0. Again, that's getting zeroed out. Now, if you do need to go back and update square footage, right, for any of your sites, the way we do this is back at the landing page under that My Entity listing. All right, again, click on each library separately, verify the numbers, update as needed. So we'll start with the main library. So when I click on the name as a hyperlink, first you're going to get the summary for that building. So you can scroll down to the bottom and it'll show you, what's the square footage reported for that site. All right. So it gives you, a heads up, Look at the number. Do I need to modify something? It'll also show you things like the street address. Do I need to correct the street address here? All right. Or, the library name. All right. So I come up here, you'll see a menu option that says manage organization. When I click there, it's just a really long page, right? At the top, you'll see the addresses. So that's where you'd make the correction there. And as I scroll down, all right, it's going to indicate, it should already be checked to indicate, is this the main branch? All right, is this the main library? The reason that has to be indicated is if you say this is the main library, then you're going to see the associated school district. All right, because this was a change several years ago where basically the discount rate is based on wherever the main library is located, the school district within that footprint. Right. So if this is not the main branch, right, you're not going to see the district info. So anyway, you'll see the field here that says square footage. All right. So if you need to correct that number, just, plug that in. And then down at the bottom, you'll just click on submit. All right. So again, easy enough to get this updated. And again, thank you for your patience if you don't plan on applying for CAT 2. All right. So a couple of reminders here with the application process. Like I said, most of this, we do this once a year, just as a reminder. There are 12 steps, all right? The first step in this process, and the suggested timeline, it's just that, a suggestion, right? Some of this we don't know hard deadlines yet, all right? But the first step is always assessing your needs and creating your plan, all right? This applies to both CAT 1 and CAT 2. All right, we've talked a lot about CAT 2. So if you're looking at applying for that, okay, if I'm not SEPA compliant, what do I need to do to change that, to get that process started? What hardware, maybe I am SEPA compliant, or I'm going to work toward that. What equipment do I need, right? Do I need to, do an access point refresh, right? Start looking at that. For CAT 1, you want to go back and look at your existing contracts. So if you have a multi-year contract for, the circuits going out to your branches, when does that contract expire, right? If it's going to expire this coming June 30th, 2026, right, then you need to file a 470 to renew that service, right? To go out, get pricing, get quotes, and decide, as far as entering into a new contract, either with the same provider or a different provider. All right, but start looking at that now. The other thing is, maybe I'm in the middle of a 5-year contract, but I've realized for one of my branches, I need more bandwidth. Okay, well, does your existing contract allow for a bandwidth upgrade during the term of the contract? So, have those conversations, with your service provider. So those are the kinds of things you need to be looking at. We talked about, updating during this admin window. Now, again, we know when that opens, should close early mid-January. Now, and like I said, these are just suggested timelines here. All right. Now, if you do have to file a Form 470, right, you're not using one of those, that Cabio or that small CAT 2 exemption, right? If you need to file a 470 for any, everything else, right? Again, the 470 is currently out there, but it's going to be, it's going to get updated, but you could still go ahead and use the current version. Again, we don't know when that deadline will be for that. It's typically, suggested that you get this done by January so that you have time to evaluate your bids. Remember, when you file a 470, it has to be out there for a minimum of 28 days. All right. On the 29th day, that's the earliest you can start evaluating the bids. All right. So, and you want enough time to do that bid evaluation, if it requires board approval, getting things signed off on. All right. Don't wait to the last minute. All right. So once you file that 470, you wait that, minimum of 28 days. And remember, that's 28 calendar days. All right. When you submit a 470, as soon as you hit submit, if you go back into the portal, it's going to say, here's your allowable contract date. That's the 29th day. That's the earliest that you can start evaluating the bids. All right. So if you receive 2 or more bids, remember, you have to do a bid evaluation. E-rate does not require a minimum number of bids. You could just receive 1 bid. And if it's cost effective, you're good with it. you could just go with that bid. Well, obviously, if there's only the one, there's nothing to compare it to. All right. So there's no bid evaluation. Two or more, right? You do that eval. All right. Now, when you do the evaluation, price has to be the highest weighted factor, but of course you can look at other factors. Is this a local vendor? Previous experience with the vendor. Do they currently have a spin? Any of those, requirements that you put on the 470, did they meet that? All right, do that evaluation and you assign points. But again, cost just has to have the highest number of points. So E-rate, bottom line, does not require that you go with lowest bid. You just have to be able to justify why you went with, say, a bid that might have been a little more costly. Okay, 471, I call this the Mac Daddy of all the forms. It's not hard. It's just a lot of information that you have to provide when you file the 471. Again, we don't have the dates for that. So we wait for the FCC to announce that. Typically, it's about the third week toward the end of March. All right. So the way this works is, if the FCC says, okay, March 25th is going to be the 471 deadline, we count back 29 days, and that determines the 470 deadline. So it's this domino effect, right? We have to wait for the 471 deadline to calculate the other dates. Okay, all forms go through application review, that program integrity assurance review. That typically happens somewhere around March. It could start sooner until about August, but this year, like I said, here we are October, and we still have forms in review. All right, so it's not necessarily first in, first out as far as getting your funding letters. All right, so then we wait for that FCDL, that funding commitment decision letter. Typically, the last several years, the first, what we call wave, first batch of funding letters, usually, like I said, the last couple of years have been released about mid-April. All right. Also, like this past funding year, or filing season, within hours of applicants submitting a 471, they were getting review questions. All right, I experienced that myself. Within a couple of hours, or at least within a couple of days. So watch for those emails letting you know that there's some inquiry out there. All right, 486, again, a little bit of a moving target, but if your funding letter is dated on or before that July 1st date, October 29th, to the deadline for most of those. Receiving service, we've covered all of that, and then actually receiving the funds. All right, it's the bare form, the 472, if you pay the invoice in full, and then you file for reimbursement if you get discounted bills. And this is your choice. USAC has stressed this is applicant choice. All right, just know that some companies, especially if it's like kind of a mom and pop hardware company, they may not be able to kind of foot the bill, right, to invoice you, let's say, your 20% discount rate, and then wait on USAC to reimburse them for the 80%. All right, so you may experience some pushback there. It's your call, right, whether you want to push back. All right, that's your choice. All right, but then the deadlines for those. So for the 2026 funding year, all right, October 28, 2027 for recurring service. Okay, I think we pretty well covered this. I do want to point out here, for the category 1, we talked about, that recurring service, the 12 months, July 1 through June 30th. All right, but C2 equipment, all right, anything that equipment under internal connections. We've talked about how there's an 18-month, period to get the equipment, get it installed. In addition to giving you that extra time, another benefit here is, if your fiscal year goes from July to June, all right, because again, the earliest you can start receiving the equipment is April 1st. All right, well, maybe you have some funds, maybe left in the budget that can go ahead and pay for, you could go ahead and purchase a portion of that equipment. All right, there's nothing that says that you have to purchase everything at one time. So you could do partial, purchase orders. Right. So again, just keep it in mind, depending on, like I said, where your fiscal year falls. All right. So if it is that July to the end of June, it literally touches 3 fiscal years. All right. So again, you could go ahead, like I said, get it ordered, get a portion of it, purchased, and then, do the bulk, say the next fiscal year. Now, a lot of this, again, we've already covered as far as filing that 470. Do you have a contract coming up for renewal? Anything new that's outside one of those bidding exemptions, like the CABIO or that C2 exemption, bandwidth upgrades, again, all of those things to consider. Now, some contracts, you'd have to go back and look at the contract. All right. Some contracts will have language in it that says, after the at the end of the initial term, that you can renew this. It's called a voluntary extension, where let's say it's initially a 60-month, and at the end of the contract, you can do maybe 2 one-year extensions. So you could choose to turn that 5-year into a 7-year contract. All right. It really is voluntary, right? You come toward the end of the, say this fall, early winter, your contract, if it has this extension, you could put something in writing to the service provider that says, yes, I want to use this option. All right. It allows you to extend your contract. It also delays going back out to bid again. All right. This is something that, if you're filing a 470, say for new service or a contract renewal, you could put that on the 470 that you want to, have that option in your contract. Some service providers will do that, some bulk at it. All right. But again, you could put that as a preference on the 470. Just make you aware that that is an option. All right, we've already talked about 470, waiting the 29th, basically start evaluating on the 29th if you choose. All right. I will be doing the 470 training, and Christine, we've not had a chance to talk about this, but one of the things I offered yesterday and again this morning with the school applicants, with the changes coming to the form, I can do another 470 training, like say later in November, early December.
Okay.
If that would be beneficial.
Yeah, with the category 2,
Yeah.
this ESL that kind of up in the air. Yeah, let's maybe take a look at that, Lori. Let's maybe take a look at that.
Because at this point, we don't know what the new form will look like, the updated form.
No. But as you said, right now you can't go wrong if you click both of them, right?
Correct.
So yeah.
So when I do 470 training next week, that's what you're going to hear. If you're asking for this type service, renewal license, make darn sure you put it under both as a just in case.
Yeah.
So you can go ahead and use the current version. It's not going to get rejected, if they update the form. So there's no harm in getting it filed. All right. But I would be happy to do another round. If there's significant changes.
Yeah, we can talk about dates when we finish up here.
Yes.
That's good.
Yeah. And at this point, we don't know when the new 470 will come out because again, they're going to wait for the approved version of the it may be a little bit of a moving target, moving dates around a little bit, but
yeah,
willing to go there. So all right. So I talked about how you have to wait the minimum 28 days. Again, remember it's calendar days. Now it's also it's based on the date that you hit submit, not based on the time. So whether you submit this at 9 a.m. or 9 p.m., all right, that's counts as day one. All right. After you submit the form, and I'll show you this during 470 training, it's going to come back and say, here's your allowable contract date. It's going to notify you of that. All right. So that's where you make note. Here's the earliest date that I can start doing that evaluation. Okay. One thing, this is not in the slide deck that if you went out and grabbed it off the site, this is something I added really quick after my morning session. This was something that has come up, something we experienced over the summer with an applicant. So when you go to log into the E-rate portal, all right, you click on sign in, and it initially, basically the portal uses MFA, right? So the default is to email you that multi-factor code, right? So you go out to your email, you get the code, you can copy and paste, whatever, plug that in, all right? But once you log in, when you're at what's called the dashboard, All right. There is an option to add receiving that MFA code via text. All right. And the reason I'm adding this to my training, this past summer, we had an applicant where there was coming up something that they needed to respond to in the portal, and their email system got hacked. So they could not receive emails. So they couldn't get the MFA code to log into the portal. They reached out to USAC and said, okay, is there some workaround? And the answer was, well, didn't you add, to get this as a text message? Well, no, I didn't know that was an option. Well, the only other option is create a new account, using a different email address. That really wasn't an option either. Okay, so my suggestion to you, as a just in case, that once you initially log in, right, you get the emailed code. Once you get to the dashboard, now there is nothing on this page that initially tells you that this is an option, right? You have to know where to look. So from the dashboard, if you come over, it'll show you your username, right? How did you log in? And you'll see a pull down. When you click on the pull down, you'll see the option for settings. All right, click on settings. Now you're going to see there's a number of pieces of information. I don't think I can get over to it. It's probably logged me out already. All right, but you'll see where there's an option to change your password. Right below that, it talks about extra verification. Now on mine, it's going to look a little different because I've already set mine up. All right, but you'll see the option to use text messaging. All right, and if you click on that, that yes, you want to use this, you'll get, okay, what's the phone number? It's going to send you a text message, to verify. Yeah, put in that code, and it's going to verify that, yep, this is the correct phone number. Most of us have dealt with this. Okay, but again, it could save your bacon. All right, I'll put it that way, to have this option. Right, it's like I said, I haven't included this in my training before, but it was pretty extreme this summer. All right, like I said, it caused a lot of issues. So do yourself a favor, go add the text messaging to get the code. All right, so what's next? Well, we've already covered, admin window, updating square footage, reviewing Cat 1 contracts, preparing. Is there anything new that you want to apply for? Start that now. The sooner you can, start planning, the better. Make your plan and follow it. Questions? And this is how I think most of you know how to find me by now. So um, every possible option. I also included USAC's contact. So if you do need like a new entity number, it's all listed there.
And Lori puts this up here because she means for you to use it. For folks who there are a few folks who are veterans but new or to the who have done it before, but it either has been a minute or this is just the second time around. Lori said yesterday we're not allowed to call ourselves veterans till 3 years. This is my 4th year, so I'm barely a veteran. I know enough to get folks through most of it, and more on the USAC side than some days I care to know. But the other thing, and I think most of y'all here know this, that you don't have to deal with category 1 at all if you have your just a single site. And folks who do have branches, if you get through this and you'd rather just concentrate on category 2, Oakland does have the managed branch connections. It is not always cheaper to go that way, but I will tell you it probably is less hassle. But again, we do these trainings so that you have options. You have options and you have support no matter what you want to do. And category 2, check all the boxes, ask all the questions. John, have a little branch on the lake with a shipping container open June to August. Does that qualify as a branch for purposes of category 2? Oh, partial year, kind of like there's one of the oh gee whiz. Somebody has a branch on Kelly's Island that's only open part of the year too. So Lori, you want to speak to that?
Sure. Yeah, as long as it meets the definition of a branch, that's the first thing. Okay. Yeah, it would qualify. Um, yeah, just, you would want to get an entity number for it because there's no requirement that it's used X, period of time. It's just like if you think about the schools that are closed over the summer, over the holidays, where that's equipment is sitting idle for the most part. But yeah, that would still qualify. You
Great.
Yeah.
could
Thank you.
even, if you wanted, because you can move equipment around within your branches. That's something that we can now do since it's a branch, or excuse me, a library system budget. So if you needed, say you had an access point I like that name, the little branch. If you wanted to take it out temporarily and use it at one of the other branches and then bring it back, during that 3-month period, you could do that. Just keep track of where it's physically installed at any given time.
Yeah, we do offer wireless there for the beachgoers.
Mhm. Yeah, and again, this would, because it's defined as a library site, just like a bookmobile, whatever. Yeah, you could do, a hotspot for that because that would be the most cost effective.
Right.
Even if you needed a couple of hotspots, you could justify in order to have adequate access, and that this is still the cheaper option, for those limited number of months.
That's great. Thank you.
You're
And
welcome.
John, we'll have to set up an entity for that, a branch entity for that, but that's very easy.
Okay.
Yeah,
Great.
that's
Thank you.
exciting. Yeah.
Cool. Today I learned that there's a branch library on the North Shore in Lorraine. I'll
That's
have to
awesome.
check
I
that
love
out
Lorraine.
sometime on
Yes.
work time, right? Oh, not kidding.
When I was doing, pre-COVID, I would travel the state doing training for the schools, and I'd have library folks attend some of those as well. And I would do training up in Lorraine, and I loved going up there. Yeah, I miss it.
I'm going to move my office there this summer, I think.
Yeah,
Sounds very
I think
reasonable to
so.
me. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Are there any other questions? See, Christine, I'll go ahead and stop the recording.
Sounds good.
I think we're good to do that.
All right, you've got options, you've got support, you've